This is the CUNYCast, smart voices, good stories, and thought-provoking conversation from the City University of New York. I'm Rick Firstman.
The reaction is, well, that's heavy, or we can feel the fear. There's sadness, there's overwhelm. And in fact, that's exactly what, in some respects, we want people to come away with.
The Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College is New York City's foremost center of local Holocaust memory. For many years, it's been a home to dozens of Holocaust survivors and their families in Queens and Long Island, a place to share their memories and help keep the history of that dark time alive for future generations. Some of these survivors tell their stories in the Kupferberg Center's newest and most ambitious exhibition. It focuses on the scope and horror of the Nazis' vast system of concentration camps and other sites of terror, forced labor, torture, and mass murder. We know the most notorious death camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka. What few people realize is how vast the Nazi system really was. Some 44,000 sites across Europe and North Africa, far too many even for the 20-foot map that is one of the exhibition's centerpieces. The exhibition is called The Concentration Camps Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide, and it's the result of 2 years of work by a team of curators, researchers, and creative contributors, aided by 12 student interns and fellows. With the reopening of CUNY campuses, the Kupferberg Center is welcoming visitors to the exhibition at a time when the world is focused on current-day authoritarianism, swelling ethnic hatred, including a surge of anti-Semitism, and a war in Ukraine that has evoked memories of the Nazi atrocities of World War II. Laura Cohen is the executive director of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, and Cary Lane is its longtime curator-in-residence and a Queensborough English professor. I talked with both of them about creating the concentration camp exhibit and the story of the Kupferberg Center, which has grown over the past 40 years to become one of Queens' most important historical and cultural centers. First, Laura Cohen. Let's talk a little bit about the Kupferberg Holocaust Center first, how it came to be and what you see as its mission today, particularly in the context of other Holocaust education centers around the country.
So our center, the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center, was established in 1983 by Queensborough Community College's then History Department Chair, Dr. William Schulman, who's still very much a figure within the field of Holocaust studies. And it started as one of the first research archives to the Holocaust on the East Coast. 1983 was not that far out from the Holocaust. The groundbreaking television series Holocaust appeared in the 70s and really started to create a conversation in popular culture. But in, the early 80s, it was not so easy to go off and do research. And so at the time, Dr. Schulman spent gathering books that were published. He located microfilm, and he also began with his students to interview many of the Holocaust survivors that lived in the eastern Queens and Long Island area. And over the course of probably 10 to 15 years, interviewed about 200 people. At the time, he oversaw a growing library as well. And the center was very significant because it was one of the few places you could come and do research. But over time, the center grew in terms of its relation to the community. And it was through the center's second director, Dr. Arthur Flug, where Dr. Flug's connections in Queens enabled him to bring a larger audience, especially a lot of the older Jewish members of the community, many of whom were Holocaust survivors or who had relatives that had survived. And since then, the center really has not only become part of the fabric of Queensborough Community College's campus, but also has remained a very important connection to Holocaust memory in this area, in a city where there are lots of other organizations that do similar work.
Over those 4 decades, the study of the Holocaust has kind of expanded, hasn't it, to more broadly to genocide studies.
Well, it's interesting because Raphael Lemkin, he coined the term genocide, and he himself was a Polish lawyer whose family had been killed during the Holocaust. But before that, he had been doing a lot of research. He had been looking at the genocide and starting to think about the mass murder and extinction of Native American and indigenous people in the United States. He had been looking at what we now know as the Armenian genocide. And so over time, what we start to see is more and more historians, more psychologists, more sociologists, more philosophers, more religious leaders, specifically rabbis and people and Jewish people, starting to really wrestle with this memory and trying to understand what's happened from a variety of different perspectives. But also, other people start to take interest, because World War II isn't just the Holocaust. There's so many other battles, and it involves, many countries and the movement and murder of millions and millions of people, not just in the years leading up to the war, but after, and forced displacement and so forth. So a larger number of people start to take interest, and over time, more records become available. And, what we see now also is the proliferation of Holocaust and genocide studies programs and centers from around the world. It's possible now to get a bachelor's in Holocaust and genocide studies as it is to get a master's degree or a PhD. There are tremendously reputable programs that are out there. There are certificate programs. There are libraries. There are archives. There are museums, there are hybrid institutions like ours, and other genocides have happened since the Holocaust. We think about Cambodia, we think about Rwanda, we think about Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We start to think about, more critically, the Armenian genocide. We start to recognize that what's happened in the United States against Native American and indigenous people is mass atrocity and genocide. And so there are all of these different ways now of thinking about how populations are singled out for expulsion, for mass murder, and for essentially extermination.
So let's talk about the new exhibition, which is quite remarkable. It's called The Concentration Camps Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide. So in conceiving and curating this exhibit, what did you and the curator, Cary Lane, set out to do?
Holocaust memory is as relevant today as it was then. In fact, sometimes even more so. It gives us a perspective on understanding the past and gives us the language to kind of sometimes see what's taking place in our society. It doesn't mean the same exact thing has happened, but there's a lot of lessons that we could learn. So Dr. Cary Lane, who is Associate Professor of English at Queensborough Community College and the KHC's longtime curator in residence, we wanted to think about how do we make this engaging for students and faculty, as well as to the broader community that is attached to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. So we wanted to focus on an exhibition that connected specifically from the past to the present to give us perspective. So we settled on the topic of the concentration camp system because in many ways it is the dominant memory of how we think about that atrocity. For our students, it was very important to understand two parts. The first is this is a system of incarceration. Extermination camps, gas chambers, and crematoria is not the story, the sole story of the concentration camps. It's a critical one, but it's not the only one. That in fact, the system of incarcerating people and singling people out well before mass murder happens, when we start arresting people, sending them to police stations, to detention centers, and early concentration camps or forced labor sites. Over time, the system and the strategy becomes much bigger, and it becomes increasingly more deadly, and it includes brothels, it includes concentration camps, it starts to include extermination camps, and ultimately, even as the Nazis are losing the war, they start bombing the extermination camps, and they start taking prisoners and forcing them on death marches. And I believe it's the Wiener Institute Library in England that starts now thinking about the death marches as mobile concentration camps. So the first is the system. The second is to help students understand 6 million Jewish people were exterminated during the Holocaust. Millions more people were also targeted. People with disabilities, the Roma and Sinti, Polish people, members of the LGBTQIA+ population, political prisoners, people who were deemed asocial. There is a tremendous number, also prisoners of war. So when we start to look at millions and millions of people, we start to understand that the Nazis had a much greater vision. Yes, Jewish people and the extermination of Jewish people and the vanquishment of them off the planet is central to that, but it's not the only way the European and sort of the larger territorial expanse of the Nazis is focused on.
And there's just an incredible number that you cite. So 44,000 concentration camps and ghettos across Nazi-occupied Europe and North Africa during World War II. Poland and Germany, the names of the concentration camps that we're all familiar with, but so many more across Europe. And people don't know that there were that many.
So the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we often refer to as USHMM, under the guidance of Dr. Jeffrey McGargy. He is a historian who devoted his life to researching and documenting the concentration camps across the world. He has left a team at the museum who's created a 6-volume encyclopedia. There are so many different sites. It is impossible to create memorials at every single one. Often in Dachau and in Treblinka, the properties are enormous and they're satellite camps, and there might be areas where prisoners were forced to march and they might be buried deep in the forest or they might be hidden. And so it's not entirely clear, unless the local community or a historian is going to kind of do research to figure out what actually happened there. In some cases, I've been to villages where people don't want to talk about what took place there. Or I remember going on a trip with the Auschwitz Jewish Center, which is related to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, and we went to a clearing in a woods in a village in Poland where there were tons of mass graves. But it was very hard to find it because the local community just doesn't want a lot of people coming there. And that doesn't mean that necessarily the people living there are collaborators, but it means that they're also having to reckon with this very tragic and violent memory in their community. And that absolutely does have an impact on them. So the scale of the system is enormous. And as more people conduct research, more additional people start to find camps and ghettos and things like that. So after we decided on the topic, we decided to also work with a postdoctoral fellow named Jason Tingler, who graduated from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And then we started to think about, well, practically, what does this mean? Because we could spend our entire lives doing research on the camps. We have a very finite amount of space, and we're at a community college campus. So how can we communicate this in readily accessible language using a simple structure that our students and faculty are going to be able to relate to? Ultimately, we decided to have 6 sections. The first would focus on the strategy, and then the next 5 sections would focus on different kinds of camps, which also align generally with the chronology of the war. But there was a very large team of people that were involved. We worked with a designer, Robin Schwartz. We worked with a videographer. We worked with an editor. And then we also worked with, I think, about somewhere between 8 and 10 mostly Queensborough Community College students, either as curatorial interns or fellows. Some work with us for a semester, some work with us for many. If they stayed with us longer, we gave them additional responsibilities. The students were involved in doing a tremendous amount of research, especially through the photo archives at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, also looking through Yad Vashem's archives, as well as Auschwitz-Birkenau's. So students were very much a part of this, and I think that one of the things that was also very intense for all of us, which is the emotional reaction of having to sit so intensely with this work. I remember going through the photographs after Cary and Robin decided to curate ones, which would go on the walls, which would go in the catalog, which would go in PowerPoint slides that we put up on the website. And I spent a fair amount of time crying. I remember the first time our associate director, Marissa Hollywood, went to look and edit the catalog. She spent a lot of time crying. And I think that it speaks to the complications that people in our field wrestle with on a daily basis. I think we have to, sometimes we do put up a wall to kind of protect our hearts and to protect our souls, but ultimately we're very committed to the work because we feel very strongly that if we don't talk about it and want to invite people to learn about this history, who will? It's our responsibility that we owe not only to survivors, but to the next generation of people. So it was a continuum. So in August 2020, we launched the first part of the website. In August 2021, we were able to physically install the exhibition, and then most recently we were able to launch a virtual tour of the exhibition, which gives you a 360-degree view and then also sends you to the website for additional information.
Yeah, I should say that the the digital version, the 360 degree, and the virtual presentation online is extremely well done, and I looked at a lot of it, and before coming and seeing it in person with you, and I have to say one of the most striking parts to me is this collection of sort of mugshots of victims. I just found myself just staring at their faces. They're so vivid, and connecting with them, imagining them and their lives. What is it like to work with that all the time?
When we were conceiving of the exhibition, we spent a lot of time talking about the team's mental health. The lighting is really important. It doesn't feel like a dark and depressing place, but there is a certain degree of protecting our hearts from what's on the wall. There are days I walk through the space, I see everything, but I've seen it now a lot, so in some respects, I don't see it the same way as the first 15 times I saw it. We're spending a lot of time now, as the campus opens up and more people come through the space, we're thinking of how do we give tours? We can't in an hour give everybody the history of the Holocaust, and specifically the concentration camp system. That's what the catalog's for, the website, and the text inside the exhibition. But what we've been talking a lot about is how are we helping people, supporting people, guiding people through the emotional reaction. That's the piece that's significant. The front of the center and the back of the center both act as thresholds, where we have two iron gates, one at the front, one at the back, that are evocative of the gates that would have greeted in air quotes, prisoners going to Dachau, prisoners going to Auschwitz-Birkenau, Arbach-Mack-Frei. We want there to be a threshold where they step into a space. I can tell you, just from the small number of people that have come through already, the reaction is, whoa, that's heavy, or we can feel the fear. There's sadness, there's overwhelm. And in fact, that's exactly what, in some respects, we want people to come away with. Because the hardest part for me doing this work is working with survivors. And survivors in Srebrenica and survivors in Cambodia. These are people like you and me. There's nothing different about them, like at all. And in this field, we spend often so much time looking at gruesome imagery or what happens to people as they've gone through this process of degradation and torture, and ultimately many being murdered, that we don't think about who they were as people before that. And even during interviews, a lot of times people or interviewers will focus on the atrocity itself and a person's survival as the dominant part of their story. And that's not all who they are as people. So remembering and paying tribute to vibrant individuals who, especially when we think about the Holocaust, lived in colorful lives. These are not black and white, the images we might see are black and white, but their lives were rich and full, is super significant, and I think can also personalize it for people who come through.
Yeah. And, you talk about people experiencing it, particularly young people, students. What's your sense about the state of awareness of the Holocaust among students and other young people right now?
Awareness is low. I think as we look at this polarized climate, images of the Holocaust and parts of the concentration camp system and the discrimination against Jewish people are being used as metaphors, but I think it's very hard for young people to access this memory unless they specifically seek it out. And the purpose of Holocaust education centers like ours, and they exist all across the country in various forms. They might be part of local synagogues, they might come out of Jewish community centers, JCCs, they might come out of different community organizations. Many, including ours, are in a university setting. There are many, many museums of all sizes. Our job collectively is to generate awareness. Some programs focus on teaching teachers middle school, high school, we focus on community college audience. Museums will focus on a much greater set of people, from young students coming through to older members of the Jewish community. So collectively, we're always trying to create awareness, but make it relevant for people. It's not something that happened in the past.
Yeah, it's unfortunately hard not to have today's events in mind. When we think about the Holocaust, there's the rise of anti-Semitism in this country and around the world, hate crimes against Jews increasing, incidents like the murders at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the hostage incident in Texas, and here in New York, I think it was NYPD statistics showing a big increase in hate crimes against Jews. How does all of this play into your work here at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center?
One of the things is the KHC we think of as a canvas. So we work very closely with Queensborough Community College faculty, for example, to create partnerships to create programming. So we work with the art and design department here on a museum and human rights series to make connections in the museum field and human rights field that are related to the Holocaust in some way, or at least allow us to have that conversation. We run an annual National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium. Each year has a different theme that connects the past to the present, that specifically helps us make connections of things that occurred in the Holocaust to contemporary politics. This year we're focusing on internment and liberation. So we have conversations with faculty members and scholars around the world looking at different ways to contextualize this history. We also do partnerships with the Queensborough Performing Arts Center on performances and music and such that makes these connections. So I think of it as like really important that even though the concentration camps exhibition is focused on the period of World War II, generally speaking, leading up and a little bit after, these things are still happening in our society. And so I love the idea of us being able to work with faculty to kind of think about this. And also they bring their own ideas. The Holocaust, to study it, people take their entire lives. There's no one way as a person I can know all of this. I love partnering with other people to come up with different ways of talking about the history and finding new ways to think about Holocaust memory. We're starting to do that a lot with the commemorative events that we run. For example, with Yom HaShoah, which is a Remembrance Day for Holocaust survivors, thinking about bringing our audience, and I mean students, faculty, and community members, different ways of looking at this.
And yeah, and a university, all universities, but I think CUNY especially being so big and diverse, far-reaching in such a diverse city, we play a real important role in talking about and contending with ethnic and racial hatred against every group. The exhibit on the concentration camps is open, and we're encouraging everybody to come see it. It's excellent. It's obviously disturbing and sobering, but very important. Thanks for talking about it. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
The new exhibition at the Kupferberg Center was 2 years in the making, under the direction of Cary Lane, an associate professor of English at Queensborough, who's the Kupferberg Center's longtime curator in residence. This exhibit was the fourth that he's curated, and I spoke with Professor Lane about the challenges of curating and mounting an exhibit of such darkness, and what it meant to the students who work with him.
The Nazi concentration camp system was immense, There were 44,000 camps, which is staggering to those even who are interested in history.
Yeah.
So interpreting this very sort of complex and complicated historical subject and present it in a way that's sort of clear and accessible and impactful was really the challenge for me. And I think the students who worked with me also understood this. And I had 3 or 4 strategies to accomplish this, to take this very complicated and powerful historical information and boil it down. The first was to use our survivors. The KHC is lucky to have Holocaust survivors who are still capable of working with us and being interviewed and meeting our students. more so pre-COVID, of course, but they're still logging into our events and chiming in and emailing Laura. And we were able to interview them for testimony for inclusion in the exhibit 2 weeks before COVID shutdown. So February 2020, my team and I conducted 13 interviews with 13 survivors of Nazi concentration camps. And so I was able to feature direct testimony from our own survivors and thread it throughout the exhibit through 3 films. The students always love hearing from the survivors because it's just so direct and engaging. And hearing it's living history. The second strategy I had was to showcase actual physical materials from the Nazi concentration camp system. I sort of painstakingly found, so really in all the historical photos I was looking at, there were sort of common physical material thread throughout it. Every image had either brick, wood, cement, or steel or iron. The materials of incarceration, if you will, of Nazi incarceration. So throughout the exhibit, I was able to find vintage wood reminiscent of, say, the cattle cars or some of the larger camps. I was able to find an antique brick purveyor in Iowa, of all places, who had this warehouse brick that is, I sent him pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto Wall, and he was like, I have just the bricks of that era that I can send to you. So we had a flatbed truck come from Iowa with these beautiful red bricks of the same shape, of the same era, maybe even 20 years earlier, like from the 1910s and 1920s, from a St. Louis warehouse that just matched perfectly. We have one actual piece of cement from Auschwitz in the exhibit. The idea was that when a visitor goes through the space, they feel that claustrophobic, that feeling of sort of that incarceration, claustrophobic feeling. The space itself is quite narrow, and I'm glad you went to the exhibit. It's sort of, and so it's sort of something that you'll feel in the pit of your stomach. You may not understand why. And I think one of the other things in terms of historical content in featuring the breadth of camp victims. Queensborough is one of the most diverse colleges in the United States, and no matter where you're from, you're going to be able to see that sort of list of 24 either nationalities or ethnicities or genders, that the Nazis victimized. And so I think that's another way that students will sort of identify with the brutality of the Nazi camp system, is by recognizing that 5,000 Muslims were murdered by Nazis, and not many people know that as well. And so, yes, the Jews, statistically, there were more Jewish victims than others, but there were also Muslim victims, and I think that was important to showcase. And our students, I think, will be able to sort of recognize that that the camp system was more brutal and more expansive than they ever realized. When you step back and see that 20-foot map and just see the expanse and the complexity of this system and how this came to be, and we just thought it was good in terms of timing, in terms of what's happening in current events and in the geopolitical space, that it was something that our students could relate to, and a warning of sorts. And the craziest part is about that map is there were so many camps and ghettos that I was only able to put 1,500 or 2,000 data points on that. But that's only 7% of the total camps. And when you stand at that map and you just see so many data points and so many camps and ghettos on that map, and then realize that was only 7% of the total number of camps, I mean, it really hits you. It really hits you right in the solar plexus.
Yeah.
It's just like, wow. And also they could see, in the height of Nazi power in 1942, they basically had the expanse of Europe and the distances that they would transport the victims, from the islands of Greece from Norway, obviously from the Soviet, past the Soviet border, this was quite an operation.
That comes through very powerfully in this very difficult but very important exhibition at the Kupferberg Center at Queensborough Community College in Bayside, which is open to the public, and you can find out more about the exhibit and the center on our episode page. That's it for now. Until next time, this is Rick Firstman. Thanks for joining me.